I got a question for those who were diagnosed with ADHD pretty late in life. Did you guys go through an emotional roller coaster? Like one day you felt relief because your life made sense, but the next day you were pretty angry about it because you were wondering how you went through life having this condition and there's nobody there to help you? Well, let's talk about that. But first, I kind of need a cup of coffee. It's kind of early in the morning, so be right back and then we'll talk about it. Side note, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a doctor, I'm just explaining my experiences with being diagnosed late in life and what I went through after my diagnosis. Okay, cool. Now that that's over with, I'm gonna go get that cup of coffee. Now that that's out of the way, how's everybody doing? My name is Steve, and as I said earlier, I was diagnosed with ADHD pretty late in life. As a matter of fact, I was diagnosed twice by the same therapist within 6 months of each other. I'll explain. In January of this year, I started seeing my therapist and we started talking everything ADHD. Childhood, my home life, my work life, and that went on all the way up through September. And in September, I was having a bad ADHD week. I couldn't focus, I couldn't get my tasks done, I couldn't get my work done, my home life was in disarray, I couldn't get the motivation to go out and play with my kids. A lot of things were going on. And so when I got into my therapy session, I just went off on her. It was almost like I was yelling at her like it was her fault, going over the symptoms that I was experiencing. And finally, I just blurted out at the end of the 10 minutes, I just need to know if I'm diagnosed because I freaking need to know so that I could try and fix it and take care of myself and move on with my life. And she looked at me and she goes, "Steve, you've been diagnosed since March. And if that's not the most ADHD thing you've ever heard, I don't know what it is. Get diagnosed in March and then forget that you got diagnosed, so then you have to get diagnosed again in September. Chances are, I might have to get diagnosed in another 6 months. The point of this video is to talk about my experiences after I was diagnosed. I went through an emotional roller coaster, if you will. Some days good, other days not so much. And I'm just wondering if other people had similar experiences because sometimes it feels normal, other times not so much. My roller coaster started with relief, kind of like an aha moment. Huge weight lifted off my shoulders. And I think the reason why is because I would look back at my life and it just made sense. The fact that I wasn't a good student or that school was difficult for me, that I didn't feel like I fit in with friends or family, that I daydreamed a lot and zoned out while talking to parents and teachers. I was forgetful. I would always lose things to complete tasks. All these things just made sense. It wasn't me being lazy or not ambitious enough or setting unrealistic goals. When I'm actually setting realistic goals, I just can't follow through with my projects. All this type of stuff made sense. But after the relief started to subside, I started to get intrusive thoughts, which kind of turned me into like a grief stage because I started feeling anger, frustration, sadness, possibly a little bit of depression, definitely some anxiety. And I think the reason for this one is because after I went through relief and said my life makes sense, I started to get intrusive thoughts like, why wasn't I diagnosed as a child? Why didn't anybody notice all these symptoms that I was experiencing? Where would I be today if I was diagnosed as a child? Would I have the coping mechanisms to get through work and home life and so forth? Would I be more successful? Would I not feel behind like I do today? Would I feel like I fit in? All of these thoughts just started rushing through and all these emotions came all at once. If you've experienced grief after your diagnosis, let me know. After I was done grieving, I went through what I would call an unmasking stage. Now, to me, this was the most enjoyable stage because my wife and I, we joke around. I mean, it's the relationship that we have. Anything I do that's ADHD-ish, I basically get laughed at and we make fun of it and move on. I didn't know that I was in the unmasking stage until my wife came to me one day and says, you know, it really seems like ever since you were diagnosed, you know, the second time, that your symptoms are getting worse. And I thought about that for a while and realized it does seem like my symptoms are getting worse. Why is it getting worse? Well, I have a few theories on that. The first is I relate it to buying a new car. Prior to buying a new car, you probably have not seen this car at all on the road. But then you buy the car, you drive it off the lot, and now you see them everywhere. It's kind of like a perception thing. Now that you know you have ADHD, you're starting to notice ADHD symptoms all over the place. That's my first theory. My second theory is that it's kind of important to unmask. Why? Because we've been masking most of our lives anyway, trying to fit in a world that is not designed for us. So because we mask, we don't know exactly all of our ADHD symptoms. So you start to unmask to try and figure out what your weaknesses are and what your strengths are. You have to come up with coping mechanisms for your weaknesses, right? And you don't know what coping mechanisms to come up with until you know all of your weaknesses. So I think it's important for us to unmask. And especially doing it at home, it's kind of a safe place because nobody's really going to judge you like you've been judged most of your life anyway. Now that I have my weaknesses and strengths, now's the time that I have to try and pick my life up and move on, get it back on track. And so I call this the acceptance stage. I accept that I have ADHD now. I'm trying to make it a part of me. And to be perfectly honest, in my opinion, I actually think that a diagnosis of ADHD is not something you have. It's something that is with you. It's a part of you. You've had it your whole life and you're gonna have it your whole life. So you might as well make it a part of you and embrace it. Try to use it to your advantage whenever you can. And then try and come up with coping mechanisms and other things that you could do to try and combat the weaknesses. So you're gonna have to do this your whole life, so you might as well accept it, try and pick your life up and try and move on from here. Well, there's my emotional roller coaster. Let me know if you can relate to any of it, all of it, maybe even none of it. If you didn't relate to any of it, let me know in the comments below what your experience was, because I really want to know if other people have had the experiences like mine. I hope you liked this video. I hope you got something out of it, and I will see you on the next one.